So what about your future? Do you plan on going? I know you're from Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So interesting. You're from Eastern Germany. So when there was an Eastern and Western Germany, you were from that side before the wall came down.
I think that Eastern Germany went economically and spiritually bankrupt. And the economic bankruptcy was caused because we did not find a way to make our society productive. The idea of socialism was to replace the economic terror by which capitalism forces people to produce enough value to give us shared infrastructure and so on, by moral terror, which means that instead of forcing you to work, you got a right to a job, and you basically cannot be fired from this job unless you are blatantly stealing and caught. And if you cannot be forced to work, how the outcome of your work is not directly feeding back into your economic success, if this is decoupled. How can I get the majority of people to still put in enough effort to have innovation and progress and actual productivity? And Eastern Germany did this by morally reminding everybody all the time on how important it was to work, how virtuous it was to work, have competitions for best worker of the week, of the month, of the year, put up motivational slogans everywhere and so on. And of course, also the production of motivational slogans was not very innovative. They were sounding very much like the 1950s. And it was quite ridiculous and ugly in a way. The smart people did not strive to go into government or into organizing production. That was also an issue in the East. I think that our intellectual class was deeply humanist. And if you're a humanist, and I'm socialized into humanism myself, you see people always as an end, not a means to an end, right? So you stay away from the professions where you use people, like politics and economy. So in some sense, what happened in Soviet Russia was that the intellectuals focused on art and sciences, and they had great art and great sciences, but they left the economy to idiots and the politics to thugs. And that in Eastern Germany, I think everything was a little bit more mellow. We were at the boundary between the two systems, and arguably both Western and Eastern Germany got a lot out of being in direct competition between the systems, because in the same way as the CIA supported West German unions, and the US started the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Germany after the war, to create good living conditions, to create something like a sign for the East how good life could be in the West, in the free world, right? Western Germany got a better deal than many other European countries, Western European countries, much better than Italy and so on. And in the same way, Eastern Germany got a better deal than, say, Poland or Czechoslovakia. Right? So life was relatively good in Eastern Germany, but it did not live up to the same standards as in the West, as we could see, because West German television was reaching into the East and vice versa. That was deliberate. So we would have a direct systems competition on TV. And it was something that we, and also the intellectuals in the East enjoyed, because the news would be directly adjacent, right? The East German news would be directly after the West German news, and often be slightly commentary on the West German news to correct our perception, right? So if Western Germany was talking about the successes of the capitalist system by advertising its goods and services and the progress of the DAX, then Eastern Germany would report about unemployment and police action against demonstrators and so on. And as a result,
I'm sorry for interrupting.
Yeah.
Are you saying you actually saw these broadcasts in Eastern Germany?
Yeah, of course. And that was very interesting, because it meant that we always had both types of news, and we would not believe either of them. Right? You knew that the realities that were projected into the homes of people were manufactured, and that you have to piece it together yourself by the overlap or by what's in the realm of the possible based on the known constraints.
I noticed that you often comment on the current state of things in the United States. You living there for a few years at least now. Do you see any analogy to things that you saw in Eastern Germany to what's going on in the United States now? This idea of misinformation. Every day we're reading about, this Russian organization has come in and they're affecting our elections. They're spreading misinformation about vaccines, maybe for different reasons. But do you find any analogy there?
Well, we had massive misinformation and disinformation campaigns going on in both countries in a way, but the difference between West and East was that the East was not liberal. The West was liberal, right? We were leftist in the East, but not liberal, which meant that you were not allowed to say certain things out loud in public. If you did, then you may not directly go to prison, but you might not be earmarked for an academic career. Right, so if you wanted to have a job in which you could self-actualize, maybe travel abroad, do all the things that you wanted to achieve in life, you had to make sure that you did not look like somebody who was disavowing the system and too critical of the state of affairs. At the same time, most of the intellectuals and students were critical of the system, right? So almost the entire opposition of Eastern Germany met in tacit understanding that they were basically in favor of the good things, but not of the way things were done in Eastern Germany. So they were very much an intellectual dark web. And this intellectual dark web of Eastern Germany unified many different perspectives. After the wall came down, we discovered that we oppositionals were not a united front. It was a new insight to us that some of us were Christians, some of us were communists, that were not in agreement with the way in which socialism was implemented in Eastern Germany, with the corruption of the system. Some of us were liberals, some of us were conservatives, right? And so the intellectual dark web of Eastern Germany fell apart once we entered a liberal society. And the liberalism in Western Germany meant that you could not criticize your boss without getting fired, which you could do in the East, but you could criticize the government all you wanted. And as long as you were not openly advocating for violent overthrow of the government, you were pretty much safe. And
is that true? That's true. So you could openly...
For Western Germany, yes. Not for Eastern Germany.
Okay. I see.
So in Eastern Germany, there was this thing: if you were violently, or if you were too strongly arguing against the government and the social order of Eastern Germany, the Eastern German government would often lock you up and expel you to Western Germany, which was one of the strategies that people used to go to the West, to emigrate. You know, we had the wall; we could not move freely from the East to the West. And Western Germany had an extremely liberal refugee strategy from people coming from East Germany, which was part of the Cold War. So everybody who was in Eastern Germany basically had the right to always be accepted as a refugee by Western Germany, and also be to some degree compensated for the things that they would leave behind. So if you left your home behind and so on, Western Germany would try to give you a head start in the new society. And so because
that's unbelievable.
Well, it was an active war going on in a way, right? It was not a violent war, but it was a war between economic systems and ideas. And Western Germany did have the economic power and prowess to afford taking on people who came from the East to the West. And there were very few people who tried to flee from the West to the East.
So if you wanted to leave Eastern Germany, you can just behave in a way that the Eastern German government didn't like, and they would export you to Western Germany? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but not right away. So it was an extremely stressful thing. And normally the strategy to go to the West would be to send a petition to the East German government to apply for immigration to Western Germany. And then you would be harassed for something between 2 and 10 years. To change your decision. And if you were steadfast, it might be granted. And it was very annoying. And another way would be to flee and cross the border. And this was dangerous because you could be shot at the border, right?
Oh, yeah.
And if you were so annoying that you were locked up and a nuisance, then there would be exchange agreements of prisoners to from Eastern Germany to Western Germany in exchange for some financial aid that Eastern Germany would get from the West. And but this was not an easy way, and Eastern Germany didn't make this in any way easy or comfortable. It was just what basically happened, that many of the people that were imprisoned for political offenses were given the choice to move to Western Germany after a couple of years or so.
But were there any redeeming qualities of that society?
A lot of Eastern German oppositions, when the war came down, hoped that we would become more like Scandinavia And some people said, why can't we get reunited with Sweden or Switzerland instead of Western Germany? Because Western Germany is larger, so it has a slightly more ruthless capitalism. Some of the things that I liked in Eastern Germany was, for instance, we had perfect recycling and we had no advertising for consumer goods. They stopped advertising for consumer goods when they realized that there is no point. Right? They did this out of tradition into the 60s and early 70s. And then they realized people are going to buy what they need, and why should we stimulate them to buy things any further? So you would not have this relentless attack on your minds by corporate minds that try to sell you stuff that you don't actually need. You would have descriptions of current consumer goods and services in magazines if you wanted to be informed about this, but otherwise you would just buy what's available. And there was always a shortage of goods, especially high-tech goods like power tools or cars or things like that. And
so there were lines outside of these stores that...
Yes, so typically you would get things in exchange for goods and services. So for instance, my parents had a pottery and we made beautiful ceramics, and we would trade these ceramics basically on the informal way against power tools and the things that we needed in our household in the countryside. And that worked relatively well. System. Yes, there was basically an unofficial barter system that people used to negotiate around the shortages. And there was also an extensive black market for things.
Like Commodore 64s.
Yes, things like that. You would get Commodore 64s mostly imported into Eastern Germany because our retired people were allowed to travel to the West. Once you were in retirement, Eastern Germany was no longer afraid of losing people to the labor market. And there was a constant brain drain from the West to the East. And
the opposite, east to the west, right?
Yeah, from the east to the west. And so if you were retired, you could go and visit your relatives in Western Germany or just travel there. And whenever you crossed the border, I think once or twice a year, Western Germany would give you welcome money. And this welcome money wasn't a lot. I think it was something like 150 Deutschmarks. But for Eastern Germans, it was a lot of money. And this money was basically meant to fund your trip to Western Germany. And many Western German grandparents would save up this money to buy things for their grandkids. There were also deals between West German politicians and East German politicians. So when Franz Josef Strauss, the ultra-conservative Bavarian politician, negotiated with East German functionaries and so on, he made sure that they personally got some money out of the deals, and he extended loans to Eastern Germany in exchange for some political deals that made it possible in some sense to weaken the East.
Wow.
And we were also dependent on the West in many ways because some of the things we couldn't import from the East. For instance, bananas were a thing that we couldn't get from the East. So we would import bananas like twice a year and then distribute them according to some ratio scheduled, which means if you were living in a village, then the village would get an allotment of bananas twice a year. And then every parent would get one banana and every child two. And all the remaining bananas were distributed by the shopkeepers among their friends. But it was in a way as just as it gets, but it was a constant shortage of things like that. And this meant that Eastern Germany had to export things to the West against hard currency. And so they could import things against their hard currency again, because the Eastern Germany had only this soft Eastern currency that was mostly in agreement between these countries.
So the last question regarding this East German, West German, this is fascinating. But so you had the impression that the Soviet sort of overlord didn't sort of demand that the Eastern Germans did so much. They sort of gave them some autonomy to allow these things to happen.
After we lost World War II, Soviet Union actually demanded reparations from Eastern Germany, and that was not what happened in Western Germany. So the Soviet Union marched into the East German cities and dismounted their factories and took actual industrial and productive value from them. And of course, this was fully deserved because Germany was responsible for waging war with the Soviet Union and was responsible for World War II. So it was all justified, but it meant that Eastern Germany had a much harsher starting position. At the same time, the politicians that started out in Eastern Germany were often idealists. So if you look at the pictures of them and see how they started out at World War II, they were largely communist leaders who had spent time in prison or in concentration camps under fascism, and that generally tried to build a better society. And they were mostly aiming for that. So their goal was not to be evil and to be like Stalin, but they tried to use the conditions under which they found themselves to do the best possible thing they could do under the circumstances, which for them meant, let's try to build a society that is as just as possible and as free as possible as we can make it under the circumstances, and is not going to relapse into fascism or capitalism. And many of them thought that any fascist society ultimately is going to go back, any capitalist society is going to go back to outright fascism. Many believed that. And it's a tendency that I think you find in a certain interpretation of Marxism that is also gaining ground in the US right now. I didn't mention what I liked about Eastern Germany. So we did, apart from not advertising things, we had a very high recycling quote. So for instance, we had like 7 different types of glass packaging, and they were standardized. So all milk would come in the same glass bottles, and they were completely recyclable. And all the mineral throughout the time of Eastern Germany, basically throughout the last 30, 40 years of its existence, it standardized most of the packaging for consumer goods and built an extremely large recycling system. The ecological impact of Eastern Germany was severe because we didn't have enough productivity to pay for filtering for pollution. Right? So we did destroy our environment regardless, much more worse than Western Germany, but we did have a lot less waste in our economy because we didn't have the incentives to produce waste in the same way. What I also liked is that we basically had no homeless people, and we had very little social inequality. If people were not integrating with society, this was not the result of them being oppressed. We called them asocials, which were people that were unable for psychological reasons to get their life in order, to jump through all the hoops that you need to jump through to not fall into addiction and social disrepair. And Eastern Germany tried to mitigate this as far as they could. So we did have social workers that tried to deal with this. And the first time that I saw actually homeless people and beggars and so on was when I visited the Soviet Union in the late 80s as a school kid. And it was deeply shocking to me because it was the first time that I saw abject poverty. So abject poverty didn't exist in the East. We lived not very well because we did not increase productivity so much since the 1950s. But we all had a basic, solid second world standard of living, where we didn't go hungry, where we could dress our kids and didn't have to worry about incidentals, and the healthcare system was decent and free.
I see.
So these you didn't need to stress out about economical circumstances at all, and this was very nice in Eastern Germany. But the price was high because we didn't manage to get the economy to work, right? So if your economy crashes in the end and your society falls apart because of that, there is very little that you have been gained. Well, except maybe 40 years without war in which you could raise your kids, which is not nothing.
So it's interesting. The impression I had for the whole Eastern Bloc was the government was modeled around the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union actually allowed for different types of governments that worked independently. That's an interesting tidbit of information.
There was
so Eastern Germany was actually had more prosperous than the Soviet Union.
Yes,
in a way.
We had a much higher. We had an objectively much higher standard of living than Soviet Union, and I think second was Czechoslovakia or Hungary, and both of them had also a pretty decent standard of living. Czechoslovakia had much better candy than us, and Hungary had great candy factories, and Hungary had a lot of exchange with Austria for historical reasons, and Yugoslavia also had a lot of freedom because their local dictator Enver Hoxha, who had unified all the Balkan states into this multinational Yugoslavian empire, had created a number of local freedoms and so on. And there was always some struggle between the Soviet Union and the degrees in which the government tried to obtain freedom for their locals. So when the Czech Republic voted a liberal government, a social democratic government into power, famously the Prague Spring happened. And the Soviet Union ended the Prague Spring by sending in tanks and ending that time of liberal restoration in Czech Republic. And so there was always, in some sense, an attempt by the local governments to try to get the best possible results for their regions, but they had to negotiate with the Soviet Union to which degree this was possible, so the Soviet Union wouldn't march in and replace the government by a different one. And eventually, when Gorbachev came to power, this dynamic reversed for a while in Eastern Germany, because Gorbachev was a true social democrat who tried to turn the Soviet Union into a liberal democracy. And for our East German government, this was too much. So they felt this was going too far, and this system stability would be endangered. And they tried to mitigate the influence of, for instance, Soviet Union media on Eastern Germany, and stopped importing the Russian equivalent of Reader's Digest, the Sputnik, which was also printed in German, into Eastern Germany. And these movements, Glasnost and Perestroika, the opening of society and democracy and the press and the opening of public opinion, that was something that was seen with great hopes by the East German intellectuals. But eventually, this open confrontation with the East German government, who said, no, we don't want to open our society in the same way as Gorbachev does it, created more revolutionary pressure in the East and put people on the streets and created pressure on the government. And the government was unable to deal with this because most of them were very old and actually politically incompetent.
Okay, but so you're saying the government in the Soviet Union was making changes that the intellectuals in Eastern Germany actually favored. They like this, but it was the government of Eastern Germany that was pushing back against this.
Yes, in the end, yes.
It's like an ultimate Stockholm syndrome, right? It's like they lived under the. I don't know
they were always in favor of communism and socialism. They didn't want to have an open capitalist democracy again. But they felt that the thing that Gorbachev was implementing in the Soviet Union would inevitably lead into an emergence of capitalism again. If you stop the moral terror, if you stop the indoctrination of people in the same way, if you open up the press, if you let people discuss ideas freely, they were worried that eventually capitalism would prevail. And it did. Right? They were correct. And the result in Soviet Union was also for the first decade or so really bad. That is, when the Soviet Union crashed, Gorbachev lost power to corrupt oligarchs. Yeltsin was bought off by the US to work against the interests of his own country. And it was made political sense to the US to obliterate the power bloc and the economic power of the Soviet Union once and for all. And Soviet Union fell apart. There was a lot of struggle and a lot of professors that had decent, livable salaries in Leningrad, now in St. Petersburg, would go into the forest to find berries to feed their families. People really did go hungry for a while, and until Putin took over and to some degree reformed the country, so it became economically somewhat prosperous again. And in the immediate time was very, very harsh for the Soviet Union, because in some sense, I think the West prevented the implementation of a social democracy. We sabotaged it. We bought off government functionaries and so on. And I think what we should have done is to stabilize democracy there and implement something like a Marshall Plan to integrate Russia tightly with the West. But it seems to me that the strategy of the US to change the government every 4 to 8 years and to have the foreign policy being mostly in the realm of what the US government decides led to short-sighted work on the world, and in some sense to a failure of American imperialism to do this best thing that in the interest of the American empire. And I grew up thinking of imperialism as an extremely bad thing. And what I didn't realize is that eventually empires are going to evolve, because they're just the evolved state of how societies pan out in the world, right? You basically have power blocks that organize themselves in hierarchies, And freedom emerges in the balance between powers, not in the absence of power, because every power vacuum will be filled by some kind of power. And as long as the power is one-sided, it doesn't have any kind of correctives, and you need this balance. And this balance, I think, led to relatively good living conditions in Eastern Germany and very good living conditions in Western Germany. It was exactly this balance between the power blocks that made it possible for the different societies to prosper. And for Germany, it was very good not to be an empire, because they did not have to build a large army and occupy other countries to make sure that they were not attacked themselves and were prosperous. They were a vassal state to the US and treated very well after World War II. And so this entire situation of Western Europe to be vassals to the US has been, I think, objectively very good for Europe. And it's in some sense sad that it ends, or it seems to end right now, because the US is incapable of maintaining a political structure with a very long planning horizon.
And what do you attribute that to? Is it the election times, the 4 years or is it the way the system is set up?
So this is just my private opinion. I'm not an historian or political scientist in any way, but it seems to me that since World War II, every generation successively lost more of the plot. So in some sense, the society became postmodern, and that happened in the 1970s, and it completely was finalized, this transformation, after the end of the Cold War, because there was no more incentive on the government to really interact with the ground truth. The US had become way too big to fail. The West had become too big to fail. And as a result, the incentives for governance were no longer to do the right thing, but to do the thing that appears to be the most popular thing in the eyes of the critics. And you have a professional class of critics in the media who interpret the theatrical performance of every politician. And the theatrical performance is now what actually matters. And this means that the system underneath the theatrical performance gets captured. So, for instance, during the last few elections, I think it became apparent that the process by which the American democracy pre-elects their candidates, right, the people that are put up for election, that is what decides what the election is about. You never have a free array of people that you can decide on, but there are a few candidates that the media will talk favorably about, so people can possibly hope to achieve any kind of agreement. Also, something that was apparent in the East, almost everybody was in disagreement with the government. But because media was not free and we were not allowed to run our own copy machines and so on, there was no way for people to agree on an alternative. And so in order to get the majority, it's just necessary that all the other opinions are splintered and marginalized in such a way that you can have never an agreement that is in a positive way about an alternative to the status quo. And the same thing happens in every democracy. You basically pre-elect a few candidates that represent the power blocks among the groups of oligarchs in your democracy. And they are proposing a sustainable policy for running the country under. And then you get the buy-in by the population by presenting the most suitable candidates to them, and they elect one of them. And in some countries, this process works relatively well, like in the last year in, say, Western Germany. So the Germans might not like the way their parties work and the elections work, but they tend to like the product. Right? Angela Merkel is seen by many Germans as the prototypical soul of Germany of her generation. She did a pretty good job, and Helmut Kohl arguably did the same thing before her. And so the candidate selection process worked relatively well. And in the US right now, it's not working that well, right? So it's very difficult for a politically competent person to get enough clout in the parties to capture the functionaries to such a degree that they would be supported.
I play a clip for you of something that you said in a panel. I know I don't mean to just spring this on you, but it was just so fascinating that it was almost prophetic.
So who gives universal basic income to the Central African Republic?
I'm not sure if universal basic income is the right solution in general, because right now labor also has another function, integrate society. And there's a very big danger of right now already in the US, the society is disintegrating along many fault lines. People have the impression that they're no longer part of the same food chain. And this is very dangerous, because ultimately it means war. It means my kids should be fed, your kids cannot be fed. We are in conflict. Before my kids are going to die, yours are going to die. I make sure of that. This is a situation that you don't want to have. So when you see people in Charlottesville in the US running around and yelling, the Jews will not replace us, what they express is they have the impression they are being replaced. They can no longer feed their kids. And you can say that they're despicable and so on, but if you look at the world through their eyes, and they might be most modeling the world, as certainly are, that's their impression. And it's a very dangerous impression to have. And we need to make sure that this doesn't happen. And if you can pay people to be good members of society, for being teachers, students, artists, cooks, whatever people like to do with each other, that is actually a very good thing.
Wow, I think that was great. And you're in a panel situation, so this is just off the cuff. You're just expressing how you feel. I thought that was that resonated with me so much. And to be specific, you're responding to the universal basic income. And there's a lot of arguments for and against universal basic income. Everyone nowadays, almost everyone has an opinion on it. But I think your opinion was so singular that you talked about the integration of society and how work brings us together. And that maybe the universal basic income isn't a good idea, not for the reasons that a lot of us think, but for the reason that work is an excuse to get us to interact with each other. I thought that really resonated with me.
I suspect that the idea of universal basic income comes out of an extension of the status quo. That is, we use labor as a tool to distribute resources to the majority and as a way to give incentives for the majority to contribute to the economic output of society and the infrastructure of society. So the majority of people gets paid by an employer or by some kind of organization for doing the thing that society approximately finds useful. And with increasing productivity due to automation, it turns out that most people are no longer economically necessary. So we basically have more laborers than we need laborers. And as a result, they don't get enough resources to participate in the economy. And this leads to misallocation of resources to the point where a lot of people would want to get haircuts or buy better cars, and the society is able to provide these haircuts and build these cars, but society cannot, because these haircuts and cars cannot be absorbed because people don't have liquidity. Right, so a lot of people don't have enough money to buy the goods and resources to keep the economy in state of circulation, and you basically have these economic blockages and blights. What can we do about this? And so natural way of thinking about this, let's give people money without asking them to do something productive for society in return. And where does this money come from? Well, we just print it. And in a way that works if you are able to regulate the money supply and take the money out on the other side without side effects. But turns out this is in practice very hard. So building an economy that works in such a way that you give everybody an unconditional subsidy without just driving up prices and creating the same regulation deficits is hard. The other thing is, what happens to people if you pay them without expecting anything in return? And this question is often answered as a whole. So the question is often answered like people will want to work because people want to be useful. And we find that if we give people money unconditionally, they will use their spare time to start new companies or to work with their neighbors or to work in soup kitchens or do all the jobs that need to be done but are currently not done because we don't have the right infrastructure to pay people for them. And the other view is if you just give people money without expecting anything in return, they will turn parasitic and turn against society and will form gangs, and society will become defunct. And the answer is not either or, but it really depends on the person, right? How are they socialized? What are their inclinations? What are they at in life? What do they want to do with their life? And if you are, say, an artist or an author or a philosopher or an academic, and then universal basic income might be good for you because you're going to do the same thing as before, but with less stress. And if you are somebody who does not want to play with society at all and has difficulty to integrate with society and difficulty to find a purpose in life and maybe has addictions and so on, then the universal basic income might have the opposite effect. It might lead people to engage less with society and feel no pressure to engage with society in the right way. And so eventually this is something that should not happen unconditionally, but conditional on the effect that it has, which means society in fixing its economic and social problems always needs to be regulating and error correcting. And if we implement measures like income subsidies or new jobs, maybe the right way to do it would be to have local communities decide what people should be doing and give local communities ways to fund what people want to be doing. And for every individual, the local community can decide these are things that we want to have done. These are the number of hours that you need to put in to get a living wage. And this depends on your personal situation, right? If you are sitting in a wheelchair, then we will not expect you to fix the local park. Maybe there are other things that you can do that are useful to you in society. Or maybe we decide that for you it's unconditional, right? But it should be something where the community has a way to decide how to integrate with the individuals. And there should be, of course, also checks and balances to make sure that the communities do not become oppressive and corrupted and kleptocratic and so on. How can you make that happen? And it's ultimately very complicated to get right.
This top-down control is very scary, I think, to a Western educated person. So it smells and tastes a lot like sort of the socialism that we're scared of, right? Because when you go far left, you get fascism, right? So you go too far left, it becomes something that's, Jordan Peterson would say, it's the gulag all over again. So I'm just saying there is a sense of that in what you're saying. So this top-down control of regulation, of judging people, whether they're, shut-ins or they're not shut-ins, whether they're going to be productive in society or not, just the fact that somebody's up there judging this, it seems like...
I think I didn't say anything normative. I just tried to describe the difficulties of organizing society in such a way. And there is a difference between left and right. I wouldn't say if you go far left, you get to fascism, as you just said. I think that fascism is the rightist movement. It's a far right. And there is the question of whether a far left dictatorial system is very similar to a far right dictatorial system. There are some differences in the ideology between left and right. And I suspect that the main difference is the focus on egalitarianism versus focusing on the well-being of your own group. And the right tends to acknowledge that there are conflicts of interest in the world that cannot be all solved peacefully, which means it is legitimate to fight for the benefit of your own group, to basically accept that you are part of an evolutionary setting. And in an evolution, there are winners and losers. And the society is going to work best if you do not completely disable the evolutionary incentives and make sure that there is some evolutionary pressure to get things right. Whereas the left tends to argue that we should all be equal, that human dignity demands that everybody gets the same access to resources or even the right to the same outcomes in life. And we should organize society around making that happen. And that's because everybody has the same value as myself. And so everybody should be treated in the same way. And the injustices that you impose on society, that the violence that you impose on society exists to mitigate the effects of the differences between people and the selfishness of different groups. And so the ideal of a classless society is something that is quite prevalent in the left. The idea that there should be no functional differences between groups in society, especially not heritable differences between groups in society, where if you are a worker, because your parents were workers, your children should be worker too. There should be difficulty in moving between the different groups and so on. Traditionally, in human society, you needed to have these income differences to give good life to a few. And the project of giving a good life to everybody is often the project of the left. So it's very difficult to negotiate all these ideas, especially when you're young. And I found that conservatives or liberals and conservatives often get closer to each other because people see the yin to their yang, or they see the long game that happens. So you no longer have a ideological perspective where you have intuitions of what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do, and if everybody just would do the right thing, we would end up with a better society. But you begin to understand that if you look at biological and social systems, design problems are usually of a higher order, which means if you do a technical design, like a computer program, you design the functionality that you want to have directly into your system, right? And the system is going to perform like this because your computer is deterministic and does exactly what you tell it to, right? You encode the functions that you want to have, and then it performs these functions if you wrote the code in the right way. In a society, this doesn't work for the most part, or in a biological system, because societies and biological systems are made of independent entities that locally strive for their own interest. Right? Every cell, in some sense, strives for its own interest. Every organism strives for its own interest. Every individual in society does. And you can make it commit to the larger thing, but the question is, what behavior does it ultimately converge to? So you have to create dynamics that let the system converge to the right behavior.
Incentives.
Yes, you have to build incentives into the system that makes it necessary for the units that understand the incentives that they're operating under to converge to the desired behavior that lets the functionality emerge. And this is true in an individual, in an organism, and it's true for a society. Right? So you have to build a system that makes people also in the next generation converge on the right kinds of behaviors. And this is, in some sense, what modernism failed to get right. We did not manage to build societies that were stable for more than a couple generations during modernism. All these modernist societies fell apart because the next generation did not perceive the same incentives that their parents operated under. So the execution of the functions of society becomes a theatrical performance, as I mentioned. Right? It's like your computer pretends to do what you want it to do, but under the hood, it only simulates or produces simulacra of the actual functionality.
So you said that ethics is the principled negotiation of conflicts of interest under conditions of shared purpose. I know you mentioned that you just reread Thomas Aquinas, and you even gave, I think you gave a PowerPoint presentation talking about the shared purpose and what that means to you.
The notion of shared purpose occurred first to me when I tried to understand love. And love is distinct from falling in love, right? Falling in love is a courtship mode. It's one where you go temporarily insane to the degree that you think that a particular person is the only person that you can possibly find happiness with in the world. And this illusion can be completely intoxicating, especially if it's mutual. But it tends to disperse after a couple of years or so. And after that, you hopefully still love each other. And love is something that is independent of being in love, right? It's almost orthogonal to it. And love is what lets us interact in a non-transactional way with each other. So by giving something to somebody you love, you don't expect anything in return. You just do this because you love them. And what does this mean structurally and functionally? And I think it means that you realize that the one that you are giving the things to are saving the same purposes as you are. And saving the same purposes is not the same purposes in your own organism, but the purposes above the ego. Right? Most of us feel that there are things that motivate us that are way more important than our own ego. Once you realize this, you notice that keeping up your ego, propping it up, is a lot of work. Right? What do you do it for? Right? What's the goal of having an ego and serving your organism and dressing well and jumping through all the hoops that you are required to pretend to have a high status or whatever, right? So eventually the goal is that there are things in life that are more important than you that you can serve best by playing your part in a particular way, right? And your ego becomes instrumental to these things. And we can call these things the sacred. And the sacred are the functions that have a longer game than the ego. They can be the relationships that you are part of. They can be the relationship that you have to your children and your grandchildren and their descendants, and the relationship that you have to society as a whole, to systems of ideas, to memeplexes that you are serving, right? The relationships that we have to the systems that we are part of. And it turns out we are not just agents that are self-interested, so the self being the model of the organism and its place in the world, but we are systemic agents, we are state-building agents, we are agents that want to serve larger things. And this hierarchy of purposes that we construct with Maslow, it ends somehow in self-actualization, which I think is an insufficient and short-sighted perspective. The hierarchy ends in the sacred, in everything that is above you. And if the sacred for you becomes a sentient agent that you are part of, that you are implementing by the shared interaction with other people, that you coordinate well enough to let sentient agency emerge on the next level, then traditionally we call this next level agent the sacred God, right? So what does God want you to do would be if we all organize together in such a way that sentient agency emerges in our structured interaction as a pattern, what is required from the individual to let the sentient agency emerge with the right aesthetics?
I think an example of what you're talking about, so this is the shared purpose. It's almost like when I give my kids money, I don't feel like they're ripping me off. I expect something in return. It's because we have a shared purpose. I want my kids to thrive. Even we can talk about it to my ex-wife, it's like when I give her money, of course, everyone has a different opinion about this, but I ultimately know that the money might go to the kids and it's going to help there. But then you take a step above that, so more macro level. I've heard the aftermath of 9/11. I've heard that a lot of Americans really united under that, and they had a shared sense of purpose. And New York City was in the friendliest state, at least the talking heads that I listened to. I wasn't there personally, but there was a sense of people being very altruistic, being very friendly to each other, this shared sense of purpose. And I think I've heard you mention that it's this shared sense of purpose that is really an existential threat to Western society. It's almost like that's the one cog in this that we're missing. Am I reading you correctly?
I think that in a society where that is too big to fail, where there are no longer existential threats, it's easy to lose that shared purpose. If you have distributed decision-making, as you have in the US, when leaders are more accountable to their followers than the other way around, the way that you can coordinate actions is to prevent the lateral spread of information and enforce a downward spread of information and ideas, right? And this is currently, I think, what's happening in the attempts to curb social media is the attempt to make sure that people don't develop ideas that compete laterally between groups, but to impose a shared narrative on people top down. And that in some sense leads to the end of liberalism. So you're are forced to commit to ideas that come top down because they come top down, not because they are the right ideas. And this was especially apparent in the pandemic, which led to a widespread failure of social systems to coordinate in the US, right? It was quite abysmal in the way in which the expertise of systems were not integrated into the behavior of the whole. There were a lot of people that realized what was going on, starting from the Secret Services in December and the individual people in the healthcare system in January and February. And the public administration and the press trying to downplay this because they had agreed on a narrative that saw this mostly as a cosmetic issue. So it was an issue whether there was a new virus coming out of China and we would need to stop travel from China was seen through the lens of whether this is a racist thing. So what does this look like in the present political narratives? For a lot of people, this is still the case, right? When right now a New York Times reporter writes on her Twitter account that she's one day we will stop thinking about talking about the lab leak hypothesis and realize its racist origins, but this day sadly is not today, right? This shows that she generally believes that the question of whether this was a leak due to insufficient regulation and we didn't react to this in the right way because we did the wrong thing, so we killed people because they made the wrong decisions, is an irrelevant perspective to her. To her, it's relevant, how does this fit into my political narrative, into the current story that I currently tell in the news? And this is the reality that she is committed to. It's quite fascinating, right? And it's not very adult perspective. And if you think that the world is about good and bad and not about results, about the outcomes of things, about the actual pain that you inflict on people, the actual death, the actual results that you will see now and in a few years from now and a few decades from now.
This is a symptom, and it's a symptom of, is it a symptom of total collapse, or is it a symptom of something less tragic?
That's like with Bitcoin. Are we in a total collapse of Bitcoin for the cycle, or are we mid-cycle, right?
There's no such thing as a total.
It's so you cannot say, I think, in advance, because I don't have enough training data to not overfit, right? I can always create a model of the past that fits everything, but I cannot use my learning of the past to accurately predict the future.
The yesterday's weather principle, you're only right probabilistically a certain amount of time.
So we're never in a situation in the world where industrialized societies failed. This is the first time that they might. Right? We never had a situation in the world where there were 7.5 billion people on the planet, and so it's in some sense completely novel. There are similarities. We saw the failure of the Roman Republic and the replacement of the rationalist government of the Roman Republic by a cult that lasted for 1,500 years. Is this going to repeat? Right? We don't know.
And what cult?
The Christian cult. Right?
Okay.
The Roman society did not manage to fix its incentives for the government. They made some wrong political decisions in terms of splitting the power of the government and allowing the wrong people to come to power and have the wrong candidate selection mechanisms and so on. They made some decisions about immigration of people in large groups that were not committed to the order of the Roman Empire, but to their own tribal orders. And this all led to downfall of productivity and local administration, and eventually society collapsed. And it was not a process that happened in a decade. It happened over many generations. And during that time, influential groups in the Roman Empire decided that their rationalist mode of governance didn't work, and they replaced it by a cult. And this cult was constructed by adopting the Hebrew religion, which was not a state religion, but a tribal religion. It was a single ethnicity that was integrated into the Hebrew cult. And they took this thing and rewrote its storybook, its mythology, into a humanist fashion by integrating Jesus Christ, and then imposed this onto the entire Roman Empire. It was like an operating system for a society that was designed to work under these new circumstances. And it didn't work particularly well. It could not prevent the downfall of Rome, right? When this megalopolis failed, the city with more than 1 million inhabitants, it had 50,000 inhabitants, and for a long time, because the new society was unable to maintain the infrastructure in terms of medicine and productivity, agricultural productivity, architecture, and so on, that was necessary to feed such a city and to maintain it. And that even Latin failed as a language and was replaced by a local provincial dialect that we now know as Italian.
And we lost technologies, right? So the Roman Empire, there was lost technologies for many, many, many years after that.
We are not a continuation of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire completely collapsed. The olive oil civilizations collapsed and were eventually replaced by the butter civilizations, by those north of the Alps. Yes, which were at the time of the Roman Empire disorganized tribes that did not believe in something like a Pax Romana, in an order that was given by adherence to rule of law. In these tribal societies, you had rights based on the number of people that you had under weapons and how well they were following you and supporting you in what you were doing, right? So power was mostly translated by the projection of power. And in a society like the Roman Empire, you build some kind of Death Star, a well-organized military that makes it impossible for civilians to interact in an organized way using violence. And if you take violence off the table, then society needs to pacify itself, because you now start to negotiate all your conflicts without violence based on rules. And all the freedoms that you get in such a society, all the non-violence, all the civil freedom and ability to prosper, I think happens because you have the state monopoly on violence. And when Samu Boja yesterday asked on Twitter, are you in favor of a Californian reformation, or who's in favor of a California reformation, right? My response was, of course, right? There is no place like San Francisco in the West. It's a really amazing place climatically and intellectually and so on. And many people are disenchanted with it and move away. But the places that I moved to are not in any way that I can objectively see better, except that they don't have the ballast of your frustrated love. And now, can we create something that is new? But there is no movement that I see that would cohere, right? Between progressives and libertarians, there is very little common ground to build a new kind of perspective on the society that we should build. There is no shared set of values at the moment. And there is no clear and present threat that would people force to unite around these shared purposes and then build the political and social and ideological structure that they would need to deal with it efficiently. So there are not enough incentives for government right now to be error correcting.
So you think the libertarians, so Silicon Valley has been known to be packed with libertarians, and the libertarian perspective is to each his own, that the taking care of the poor and the needy should be done by people with the means, and they will do so voluntarily. It shouldn't be the job of the government to do that. So it's very hard to find sort of, and you think that the more top-down approach is more appropriate. So it's very hard to find common ground, is what you're saying, between those two camps. Academia, I picture you anyways you're technical, you're a computer programmer, you're an engineer, but you're also from academia. Compared to Silicon Valley libertarians, I'm sure those conversations end as soon as you say, well, this should be done, because libertarians don't have that conversation.
I don't presume to know better.
Okay.
I just...
so you don't have an opinion on this? Is that what you're
I have lots of opinions, but strong opinions lightly held, I think, is important, because the older I get, the more I realize how often I'm wrong. And yet, then Balaji Srinivasan, who I intellectually respect, right? He is a very smart guy who's very successful in building his crypto empire. His idea of reforming society is to build charter cities. And these charter cities should only include the right kind of people that mostly get rich by doing crypto and similar things. And then somebody in the discussion asked him, but somebody needs to do our plumbing. And this is not going to be one of us, right? This is going to create social and cultural inequality. How do you deal with that? And then Balaji said, well, robots. And in this group, people were not even laughing. So I think it's cute, but I don't think that this vast gulf between his perspective as a libertarian and the perspective of the majority of people in California can easily be bridged. So it's very difficult to build a common ground, because I don't think that he has a perspective for the majority of people in California. So how can we pay Californians to be good citizens? How can we make sure that they get the resources that they need, and incidentally also provide all the infrastructure that we need for everybody to provide that good life? This is essentially the question that we are faced with. And I don't see anybody in an ascendance of power who gives a good answer to that.
And they're certainly not doing a good job of it, from what I see. At least YouTube is, it's inundated with these videos of the homeless problem in California and the crime problem in California, and what a beautiful state it used to be. And the podcaster Joe Rogan moving to Austin and dragging all his friends with him, who happen to be influential in their own spheres. So yeah, we hear not a lot of good things from California right now. So
yeah, the social differences are vast.
Oh, yeah.
The social differences are vast. I think the homeless problem is exacerbated by the fact that California has some of the best climate in the world. It's not too hot in the summer and not too cold in the winter. And the Silicon Valley is relatively wealthy and extremely liberal, which means the perspective that we have on the homeless, or that our administration has on the homeless, is largely one that people are in the situation because they are oppressed. and because they are deprived of resources, and their situation will improve if we give them more resources. So we give meals to the homeless. We provide them with free needles. We let them camp in the parks and under the underpasses without driving them out. And this means that a lot of the homeless of the US is going to converge in places like this. Right, so California has a busing system where you can get a free bus ticket to anywhere as long as you promise to not come back. So if you have relatives anywhere, you can go there and be there. And it, in some sense, halves the homeless population. But it's a temporary thing because many of them do come back. And because there is no hardcore provision against them not coming back. And in a way, I'm very sympathetic to people like Cesar Budin, our district attorney, who is very motivated by social goals. His father was a weatherman, one of these terrorists who fought for more leftist, better social order, and he's worked with himself with Hugo Chavez for a while in Venezuela, and he's very motivated by his political goals and his political perspective. And it's an extremely leftist perspective. So his idea is to not prosecute the people that commit car break-ins and little burglaries and little muggings and so on as much as possible so they can be reformed. He wants to replace this largely by social work. And it seems that he is not successful, right? Because
what's the incentive there, right?
I think the issue is that not everybody is like yourself, right?
No.
If you are a well-functioning member of society, even if you do drugs, the boundary is at which point do your drug use impact others, right? This is obviously you don't want to impact others. If you don't care about this, if you don't care about others, how can I incentivize you to care about others? Right? And not everybody is intrinsically caring about others because they don't believe in the project of the greater whole. They don't see that it happens, right? If you don't have that shared purpose, if you don't have a relationship to a shared meaning with society, how can you create this? And it probably means that you have to give some people more adult supervision, right? Some people do not function without adult supervision in the same way as Eastern Germany discovered that 5% of the population, even if you offer them a job and they don't have to work hard in this job, will not take it. Because they don't see the point. And they will not maintain their house, even if the water goes into the roof. Even if you give them the resources to fix the roof, they will not do it. The neighbors have to do it. Right? This happens. And I saw it in our neighboring village. Right? There was one family which was like this, and the people around them had to take care of their kids. And the government also went to these people and told them, if you don't take better care of your kids and wash them and feed them well, we will take them away from you. And they said, but we need our kids because you subsidize our kids, right? We get money for having kids every month. And if you take away these kids, we'll just make new ones. And so these kids were left with the family, and they didn't grow up very well because their parents were alcoholics. And the people around them tried. Yes, effectively, yes. Yeah. But it was as a result of constantly fixing, right? If you take this away, if there is a continuum between people that are functioning and people that are not functioning, and you have to make sure that you have this far end of not functioning people that don't work in a way that they can deal with all their needs, even if you give them money to do so. Right? How do you deal with people that are unable to jump through the hoops, or that are clinically depressed, or that have mental disorders that make it impossible for them to function? And society has to take care of them in a way. And I think that our leftist perspective, which says that everybody is in some sense the same, but some of us are in unfortunate circumstances, is too short-sighted to deal with issues like that.
To me, the universal basic income, the one redeeming feature it has is it didn't have that checkbox list that you just listed, right? So there was no sort of judgment from above. Well, this guy's mentally ill. This guy just doesn't want to work. It's sort of like, it's so clean. It's okay. Everyone just gets it. And I don't care if you make $1 billion. Of course, this is not the way it's been talked about with, I think Yang talked about the universal basic income. He was a presidential candidate. But Yeah, there's something
I really
very
like the
clean
idea.
about it.
Yes,
Yeah,
it's
there's
simple.
it doesn't matter who you are. You're going to get this amount of money. We're not going to go there and judge you. Oh, you're
Yeah,
spending
but
on
the world
this.
is
You can't
messy.
spend it on this. Yeah.
I would like
the
to see a
world is
simulation
messy.
first. So for all the political issues, it doesn't really matter what your heart says. I think it matters what your simulations say. So can you show
Data.
that your result or your policy is going to have the intended outcome? I also suspect that when we pass a new law, we should add a clause to it that specifies the intended effect of the law and automatically repeals it if the effect does not manifest after a certain amount of time that is also specified in that clause, right? So in some sense, we should make sure that everything that we do in our society is conditional on the expected effect that it has on society. And the fact that it is not is extremely short-sighted. But you can be as bad as you want as long as you're constantly error correcting. And if you are as good as your best intentions, you're not error correcting, and you don't have incentives for error correction, but against it, then everything is going to go down the drain.
Yeah, but and then it comes down to language, right? So you can gamify that, right?
I think that the legal system is fascinating in this regard because it, to a very large degree, attempts to formalize language so that you can prove things. And you can make all the decisions rule-based, and you have very little human influence and therefore little human corruptibility in the interpretation of the law. And sometimes it leads to absurd situations. Like there was a case, I think, a couple of years ago where there was some underage guy some kid who had sent nudes to his girlfriend, and that technically triggered some child pornography law. And then he was not only imprisoned, but the policeman responsible for him forced him to take more nudes for the police.
I think I heard about this. He was the same age as the girl, wasn't he? Or about the same age? So
I don't recall the details of the case, but the situation was that for some reason the policeman thought that the law forced him to take these pictures. Right, and at the same time, the policeman also now became complicit in producing more child pornography, and also, of course, he traumatized the child as a result, and then he was himself prosecuted and killed himself. And I think what happened was that multiple people in the entire chain of command, including the judge who authorized the policeman to take nudes of the child, were using a mechanistic interpretation of the law, which meant they didn't use any of their human intelligence in making an interpretation of the law, but only used the formalized code, and the formalized code had bugs. And this is the big difficulty when you build a rule-based system. It's often full of bugs, or it has big architectural design mistakes that were not apparent to the people who wrote the design at the time. And how do you deal with this? And there are different solutions in different countries and different philosophies. To which degree does have common sense of the judge has to play a corrective role in the interpretation of the law? And for instance, I think in Germany, there is slightly more common sense in the application of the law. And of course, the larger the system gets, the more the leeway of the common sense gets to be open to corruption, because it basically means the judge does not have to fully follow the letter of the law and can impose their own regulation, right? And how is the judge going to use that freedom? And the control mechanisms on the judge, how well are they calibrated to make sure that the freedom that the judge gets is used in the right way, which means applying common sense when necessary, and not to facilitate corruption of the law and the spirit of the law, right? So this difference between the spirit and the letter of the law is a difficulty that is also reflected in all interaction that we have with AI. When we talk about algorithmic bias, I think what we actually should mean is not so much does the interests of my local group, is this reflected in the right way in AI? Or is the AI written by a bad person who has the wrong gender and skin color, and therefore the system that they've written is intrinsically biased, right? This is not a productive perspective. The question is the machine that we are building here that is to some degree influencing the way in which we organize our interactions between human beings, does it follow the right spirit? Or is and how big is the deviation between the letter and the spirit? And the spirit here is basically the idea of how our society should be organized. In some sense, there is a similarity between communism and Christianity. And this is they both believe that there is a way to naturally organize, non-violently, the interaction of human beings at scale. Right? If you live in a family, you are usually, if your family is healthy, treating each other in a communist fashion. Everybody contributes to the best of their ability. Everybody gets according to their needs. And you are as fair as you can to everybody involved. And it's natural, right? Because you're all responsible for each other. And if you have cult-like communities, as long as they're small, you're often able to scale this. And between friends and family, right, you can do that. And now can we scale it up? And the idea of this ideal society that is scaled up over friends and family into a non-violent and completely peaceful and not frictionless way, in the best possible approximation that we can make happen, to society as an organism. That is, in some sense, the idea of communism. So it's not an economic machine that you impose on top of society that makes people work or to pay off their loans and to work for fast food chains to get money in the bank so they can buy food and so on, right? All these machines that we build to make people behave, to keep them in check. So the overarching resulting system feeds everybody more or less. This is in some sense violent. And it's the least violent form of interaction of people at scale that we found and the most prosperous. But the idea of
talking about communism.
That was capitalism. And communism would be the alternative where you don't have that economic terror, hopefully,
So
right?
Capitalism seems to be the least violent in my mind.
Yes,
right?
But it does use economic terror to keep people
cycle.
in check, right? If you don't jump through the hoops, you don't know how to feed your kids. You cannot pay them to college and so on.
Yeah.
So there are different levels at which you can have achievements and failure. And eventually the incentives are set in such a way that you need to play ball with the system around you or you're going to fail. And there are also people which believe that we need homeless people to demonstrate to others the cost of failure. Right? It's basically the homeless people tell the working poor what happens if they stop working so hard. Right? And it's a very ruthless perspective. It's very harsh and cruel. And but I did hear this when I came to the US. There were some people which generally told me, yes, we need homeless people, unlike Europeans. Because we have so many people that are so poorly integrated with society that we need to tell them what's going to happen if they don't work so hard, even for very little money.
Somebody that gives up too fast, right? So that is not the optimum solution, and he just gave up right there. The system we have is doing okay. We have homeless people. I'll sacrifice them for the system we have, but we could. In my mind, anyways,
why are American jails so terrible compared to European jails, right? Why is it acceptable that you get raped in an American jail? Why can you be killed in a jail and there are little to no repercussions to the people that kill you? Why is this violence possible? And the answer for some people is if the living conditions in jail were better, then they would not. They might end up being better than the people that we try to deter from committing crimes.
So I'm sold on this Scandinavian type socialism, but I can't find my way around of winning the debate with a libertarian. And again, I come from the crypto space, so I'm surrounded by libertarians, and it's really difficult to get through to them.
So the interesting question is, why does Norway work so well? Right, and there is the leftist perspective. It's because Norway is organized in such a liberal way and such an equitable way that everybody gets well integrated in society. And part of that is obviously because Norway is very small, right? If it's a country that has only a few million people, and the feedback loops are very short. So if government makes a decision, then personally accountability is not far because people know who made what decision when. And this leads to a situation where the people that vote you into power expect you to do certain things for their communities, right? So everybody knows everybody in a way. And these reputation systems are very hard to maintain in a society with 400 million people rather than 4 million, right?
That's the argument.
That's one of them.
That's what they give back to me, but we've never seen it tried.
Another thing is that Norway is a very homogeneous society. That is, Norwegians have an extremely similar cultural background and even ethnic background, right? And this is the result of things that happened in many centuries before. Norway is not the result of immigration of misfits from all over the world that came to make a fortune in a country with better living conditions, but it is a result of hardy people killing each other for thousands of years until those that were best organized remained with the remaining structure. Right. So the question is the homogeneous structure and shared purpose of Norway the result of many thousand years of hardship that led to a social organization that came down to the way that it is right now. And the US is a society that in some sense almost always had abundance. When people came here, they found wide open skies and a Neolithic society that was easy conquered and eradicated. It was very thinly populated because the nomadic tribes that lived in Northern America were not maintaining the countryside with agriculture, right? So they could only have a small population and had very small armies, and they had very little technology. They
not to mention the disease, right?
Yeah,
I mean, that's like a secret weapon. It's like everyone just dies before the army.
Yeah, but of course, also the response to disease is a question of how well you coordinate, right? And there was not that much coordination. They didn't have a system of medicine. They didn't study diseases in the way that they had their shamans and healers and so on. But nothing was scaled. It was all tribal. They didn't have states in the same way as the Western colonial societies had, right? So Europe had a much more aggressive, a much more, as a result, successful system of organization that easily took over. And when this system came over, it came from a relatively densely populated Europe into an open world that was fertile and allowed them to spread and build enormous riches within very few generations.
So you talked about the olive oil civilization collapsing and then the Germanic civilization rising up. Do you consider the United States and sort of the dominance of the United States a new sort of a segue from the Germanic?
I don't
is
think
it something different?
I don't think that this lens of Germanic and so on is very important, because there are many Asian societies and so on that also very efficiently organized. And the question is the society organized in a multi-layered cybernetic structure that is error correcting and is able to maintain the complexity that you need to scale up in a stable way? And there are some constants.
My question is more specifically, do you think the Germanic society collapsed and the American society is something different?
I don't think so. I think that the American society was able to overtake the European societies because it was extremely innovative. It was a stable society in some sense is stifling innovation, because innovation is often indistinguishable from cheating. And from the European perspective, the US is a society of cheaters, right? There are many things. It's fine in the US to do things that you wouldn't get away with in Europe because you know it's shady. There is a lot more.
Give me an example of
crypto. Is a good example.
What are you talking about? You don't see the value in crypto? Come on, instant. I mean, it settles instantly. It's money that's privatized. It's not controlled by the government. So the government, like you said before, can't just print more to get that shadow tax on your portfolio.
It's basically
the crypto has uses. I don't think that's a good example, actually. I think.
Okay, I'm not trying to convince you.
Oh no, you're not stepping on toes either. I'm not tribalistic. I just think there is value there. But yeah, I think there's real value there. But I think I know what you mean. So are you talking about the depth at which the German sort of car industry went? So when you compare German cars to what American cars were, so the Germans really, I guess the word would be innovated, though. Didn't the Germans really innovate their car making? I forgot who it was, but they said that the German car manufacturing process can't be reproduced in America, because in America, we just get parts that are already sort of created. We put it together in an innovative way, but the Germans, they sort of engineer the shit out of it. They make it just. Is that what you're talking about when you say innovation is cheating?
No, not quite. So I think that the question is, are you doing the right thing? And the right thing based on the aesthetics of the ideal world. Right? So do you do what God wants you to do? And US is
What is God?
God is the agent that represents the spirit of your civilization. So if you zoom out in the same way as you see that an anthill does things that the individual ant doesn't comprehend, and that the anthill has agency at the level of the anthill, you could also say that a nation state or a company has agency at the level of the organization, right? The organization, every organization in a way is an AI that implements its intelligence using individual people. And the individual people are not the spirit of the AI for the most part. They are fulfilling the roles. They are cogs and wheels in the machinery of the AI. Right? If an organization works well and if their CEO defects and wants to drive the organization in a different direction that would lead to its collapse, then a functioning organization will replace the CEO. So it's not about what the CEO wants. The CEO might direct it in a particular way and embody certain ideas that you cannot codify in rules well because it's hard to get the code right. So you have somebody like Elon Musk driving his empire of companies, and
So
people
is
are
he
accepting
innovative? Is Elon Musk innovative?
Oh, definitely, yes. He's
But you use innovative in a derogatory sense. You said innovation is cheating.
No,
That's
I said
those
that
were your
it's,
words.
what I said is that it's often indistinguishable from cheating. That is not the same thing, right?
Okay,
So
it's
there
not
is,
derogatory.
which
You're
means
saying
you
innovation
cannot,
is a good thing.
yes, you cannot write down hard and fast rules that tell you at which point it's innovation and which point it's cheating, right? Because innovation is often about taking shortcuts, about routing around existing systems. And sometimes these systems are good, sometimes they're not good. And there is no common agreement on which systems are good and which are not good. Right?
Okay,
So
give
for
me an
instance,
example then. Give me an example of a not good innovation.
Yes, so imagine that you think that cannabis is good for people on balance. And that is there's something that is very much in debate, right? There are people which say that clearly the societal balance of legalizing soft drugs like cannabis is still negative, and we should do something against it. And if we completely liberalize it, or if we liberalize it at all, this has a negative effect. And this used to be the consensus of the lawmakers in the US for a long time. And at the same time, there were a lot of people working around this consensus by growing cannabis in their backyard and building a cottage industry for distributing cannabis. And society has been somewhat accepting of this to some degree, right? And as soon as cannabis was more accepted and California passed a law on medicinal cannabis, everybody could get a medicinal permit that made it visible that in some sense people were flaunting the rules of the medicinal cannabis. They got their weed cards, everybody for a small fee, right? And the innovation here was that doctors would offer cannabis for a very small fee, right? They were still gatekeepers, but the gatekeeping had no function but supporting some of the doctors that got that money for giving out weed cards, right? And as a result, you made sure that no underage person would get the weed as a side effect of that innovation. That was cheating in a way, right? It's very hard to say at which point was this beneficial and not beneficial. And now California is, I think, leading in the industry of cannabis products. And it's still somewhat difficult. For instance, if I would buy such products and use them, and especially take them on a plane and take them abroad, I could be in trouble because I would be in conflict with federal law that still maintains that cannabis is illegal. And this would get me in violation of my visa agreements, right? So it would be extremely serious if that would happen. And California basically pretends that all these things don't exist, these federal prohibitions, and has now built up big chains of stores that are very much stocked like liquor stores. So instead of all being moonshine, of all being random weeds that somebody cultivated in their backyards, they now have approved quality and approved brands and blends, and that they are so different as gin and whiskey and wine are from each other. And people start using these products for very different purposes. And as a side effect, you now got amazing CBD products that help some kids with ADHD better than the prescription medicines, right? It's so you have all this innovation that happens together with cheating. And when the US started, they decided to cheat in an organized way by allowing their bootleggers to become legal, right? They flaunted European patent laws and produced all those things that they wanted to have in their country. And they stopped the enforcement of European patent laws completely. And they only re-implemented this after they became dominant, right? After they became dominant, they imposed the global patent law enforcement on the world. In many ways, right? And before that, they counterfeited products any way they wanted to, because it was expedient and allowed them to boost the economy and boost the local innovation. And US is a pioneer society, and so they did something on a new ground that was economically, structurally, politically, ideologically unpopulated, and they allowed many experiments. They allowed all the different short game Protestant cults from Europe to emigrate here and to thrive and to do the things that they wanted to. And new political experiments, new economic experiments were in order. And many of the tensions that we see right now is because the system has been partitioned now, and there are people like the FDA, organizations like the FDA that stifle innovation in the guise of protecting people, right? And so the innovation
sometimes they protect people.
Sometimes they do, right?
Yeah.
And arguably, there are many cases that you will be able to point at where the FDA is actually beneficial. And still, the question is, would the US not be better off without the FDA at this point? But there are some mostly libertarian friends of mine who are in favor of a complete abolition of the FDA. And if I look at the practice of the FDA, that is largely preventing the emergence of new medications. And the importation of medication from Canada or Europe at cheaper prices and so on, right? It seems that the main role of the FDA is to protect large industry from competition and no longer the protection of consumers.
So you're saying they're captured?
Yes. So the recent things that the FDA just did was you can no longer buy most of the NAC supplements that you could buy since the 1960s in the US freely on Amazon, because the FDA decided that you should now get a prescription to get these supplements. There are no side effects that I'm aware of. People were not dying from taking NAC. A lot of people think that they get a benefit from taking NAC. And the FDA just made it impossible for most people to order these supplements, right?
Yeah,
and it's not obvious how this helps people. I think that traditionally the US identified as the land of the free. And it's arguable whether it ever was, but the philosophy used to be, let's give people responsibility about their over their own decisions.
Drive through liquor stores?
Yes, the government should not decide what medicine a responsible, sane adult should be allowed to buy. I think that there could be a policy that is should maybe be tried. Maybe what the US should be doing is take a few states and let them experiment. Lift the restrictions on the state level for many regulations and let people mix and match and see which policies work and which don't. Let them impose laws on the level of local counties. Let them just try what works, and then other countries can see what works and adopt the policies. Make sure that the damage that you do is local, but make sure that the benefits of innovation can spread.
That's a libertarian perspective. That
yes,
is
but I don't think that libertarianism works, because for the first, most obviously, all the organized, smart, rich Silicon Valley libertarians are unable to even get their own government. Right? They're not able to take over even a government in the Bay Area. And if they're not even able to get the government,
system though? Isn't that the system is captured? The whole election fiasco.
Yeah, but if you cannot capture your own system, it means you are inept, right?
But it's not surprising that when the government holds all the guns, that they're not able to change this system. That's just from the top down, in my opinion. It's bought and paid for.
There are two ways of seeing libertarianism. There is this Chicago school libertarianism, which is basically a liberal, democratic and a slightly conservative perspective on how society should be organized around liberal principles. And then there is the Silicon Valley ANCAP perspective, where libertarianism basically tries to do away with all the hierarchy of social organization in society and replace it by the negotiation between free individuals.
Yeah, that's scary.
And I think that this perspective is just short-sighted. It's it's an autistic perspective, I suspect. It's one that is not seeing the deep structure of society. Yeah, so often I also don't know. I think that there is a perspective that you can try to use to interpret society in frames. One of them that I use is to see society as a cybernetic regulation system. Everybody is an agent, and coalitions between people also are, in some sense, compound agents, and they interact with each other. And they interact to the result that complexity emerges like it does in an ecosystem, and there's going to be friction, and you want to minimize the friction, especially the friction that ends in violence and destruction of property, and you want to make this sustainable, so this thing goes over many generations, so you minimize negative externalities for the system and so on. And the issue is that local agents might have incentives that are not compatible with the common good. And you have this Nash equilibrium situation where if you if you give up some of the benefits that you're reaping, you get benefits in return from the better interaction. And often that is not the case. So if, for instance, if you'd have a very good and fast and safe car and you agree to obey the speed limit, and what do you get in return? Individually, not very much, as long as you're the only one who flaunts the speed limit. But if everybody flaunts the speed limit, you get a lot of accidents and traffic jams and a lot of dead bodies at the roadside, right? So you need a system of regulation where you pay some kind of regulator who tells you for the given set of drivers and cars and road conditions, what's the optimal speed limit, and we enforce this for everybody and make sure that the incentives for everybody get changed in such a way that you have to obey the speed limit. Right, and so the government is an agent that imposes an offset on your payout metrics to make your Nash equilibrium compatible with the common good.
So they create incentives.
Yes, and shift incentives. Yes,
it's just incentives.
And the difficulty is to set the incentives right for government. So we have to have a distribution of power between the different branches of government to mitigate the principal agent problem, that basically the agent that is imposing the order on the principal on us is doing that in ways that benefit us and not him. Right? That's difficult to achieve. Yeah. Right? And in pre-democratic societies, that worked because the agents that were the government owned the country, right? There were monarchs, and they literally owned everything in the world. And at least the levies of production, the land, and it could not be easily replicated. You could not make more land. So once they had staked out the boundaries between each other, they had to produce everything on and off that land by the people that were their subjects. And if they were not governing well, then the likelihood that their empire would fail and be overtaken by the neighbors, or there would be a revolution, would increase. So they were forced to govern as well as they could with their resources and understanding that they had. And this is not really compatible with capitalism because land is no longer the primary means of production. It takes a relatively small part of the economy. It's that is about agriculture. Instead, you have now new technologies that rise and fall relatively quickly. And as a result, you have new houses that become economically powerful or lose influence. And so you need to disentangle the administration from ownership of resources and economic power. Right? And so you have a three-tiered system in democracies. You have the owner class that owns most of the resources due to accumulation. Right? All other things being equal, if you start out with more resources, you end up with, in a better position than somebody who starts with fewer resources, if you play your cards well. So you have something like a natural accumulation in capitalism of economic power in relatively few houses. And at the you don't need institutions that live longer than the individual houses, that live longer than corporations, for instance. And these institutions basically have a long-range continuity. And this is your deep state. But you don't want to govern by the deep state, because if the deep state becomes corrupt and the journalist finds out about this, right, the journalist has to die because there's no alternative to the deep state. That is roughly the situation that you have in Russia. And in a democratic society, you make sure that you come to power and lose power without use of violence. That is the core of liberalism. And that's also why Trump is a liberal, because Trump was not interested in losing power by being killed. And I think contrary to what many of my fellow leftists felt and said, I don't think that Trump was interested in changing the political order of the US in such a way that he would only lose power by getting killed. Right? He did
no,
not
and I
want
think
to
his last post on Facebook was, "Hey guys in the Capitol, could you not do violence?" I think that was his last post or something. I saw I don't know if it was just a Trump supporter that posted that or not, but
right.
if that was his last post, I don't think he wanted violence in that Capitol.
So personally, I think Trump was a terrible politician who had no sense for the greater whole and no interest in fostering it in any way. He was a bullshit artist who was only interested in his own status. But I don't think that he had the makings of a fascist dictator, because he didn't even have the political vision of somebody like a clown like Berlusconi, and definitely not of the grandiosity and discipline of somebody like Hitler, who was willing to sacrifice millions of people for some brutal romantic vision of a chosen people that were destined to rule over the others and enslave the entire world, right? I think Trump was pretty far from that. Trump was really this bullshit artist who needed to have his status elevated because he was bored and a solipsist who does not perceive other people.
You mentioned before that Hillary Clinton probably wanted to impress her father, but you were unsure of what the goal of Trump was.
I don't presume to know the psychological motivations behind Hillary Clinton, but I felt that he was motivated by making a difference in the world. So she talked Bill into bombing Serbia and brought down the Libyan government because she felt it's the right thing to do, because she perceived injustice on the ground and thought by changing the injustice, she would improve the situation of people on the ground. And I think that a lot of people around her felt that was a short-sighted perspective. And a lot of people that watched the Libyan situation felt this, if you try to make a difference without understanding the implications of your actions, you are not necessarily doing the right thing. So what is the thing that makes you forced to act? Why do you want to make a difference, right? Who do you want to impress? I don't know whether it was her father. But I think that she didn't do this to enrich herself. I don't think that she did this for selfish reasons. I think she did it out of hubris, that she felt that she understood something that the others didn't. And
but also you're assuming this is a decision that she made alone. Maybe she was influenced by other parties. There's always that possibility.
Yeah, of course. There's often compound decisions, but a lot of people, I think, felt also within their own party that it was an inconvenience what happened. And so I think that there was a lot of leeway that she had in many of the decisions that she made. And I think that for some reason, a lot of people in the US felt that she was not a believable candidate. Not sure if her reputation was deserved in every way, but her popularity was, according to the Podesta emails, also to her own campaign, so low that they decided to push the weakest candidates and the Republicans as her opponents. So they didn't attack Trump before the primaries because they thought he was the weakest candidate that the Republicans had, which would give Hillary the highest chances of winning. And arguably, I think that has been true. Right? I think that he was the candidate with the weakest political positions, with the least acceptance among educated Americans.
Agreed.
Right, and it was a perfect storm that got him to power. There were many things that came together.
But you have to say his personality was made for television. You
Yes,
can't deny that. Yeah, that if there was going to be a dark horse, Yeah,
It was he was also very good at Twitter.
Yeah, for example, yeah. And the fact that they couldn't foresee that says something about this old guard in the Democratic Party. You know?
Yes, they believe their own stories. And I sometimes felt that Trump is able to think outside of the box because he's unable to see the box. Right? He does not think in terms of these social categories. He does not believe in the narratives. He's really a bullshit artist. And I think that he just sat as a model free agent on top of a Twitter feedback loop and checked which messages get traction. And he did this until the end. And it was good enough to win over the dominant stories, because the dominant stories were becoming unpopular with the majority of Americans, because the majority of Americans don't feel that they are in a well-governed country. So they are in opposition to everything that stands in the role of these narratives.
Yeah, Dan Carlin has a podcast. I don't know if you know who Dan Carlin is. It's called Hardcore History. He's a hobby historian. But one thing he said that I really liked was the American people probably voted Trump into office because they pictured Trump like a grenade, like that they would just throw into this corrupt sort of edifice, and they wanted to see it just explode.
Yeah, I think that Trump did demonstrate to the US that their system is in peril and that it's broken. And maybe the reactions to Trump were not always the most healthy ones, especially during Corona, right? When people adopted and rejected medical explanations like whether hydroxychloroquine worked or not, was for some people contingent on whether Trump supported or opposed it.
Ridiculous, right?
Yes, same thing for travel bans and
there was a report that said that the coronavirus, what they needed was not a drug, but something that reduced the impact of one's own immune system. And then I Googled what that drug was, and it said the leading, one of the things that it does is it lessens the effect of your own immune system. So he was kind of right in that case. It wasn't a political sort of thing, it seems like. He actually got advice from a medical professional.
Yeah.
I think,
so yeah, he was basically he probably had a somewhat capable doctor who was informally interpreting the studies from his local perspective and was giving him advice. And it was somebody that he trusted because he seemed to have common sense, and he was reporting these things, which are not the outcome of the studies of the medical community, but the best understanding of his personal doctor, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, but the Trump era seems to be over. I don't know if he's serious about running again, but
I don't think so. But who knows? I also think that he wouldn't have a chance because right by now the opposition against him is so well organized that he is not going to get the same social media presence. And without being able to broadcast, you cannot get to power. And it's also a window that I think a lot of movements have missed in the US because social media is no longer open. As soon as you start to build a meaningful political movement, you probably will have difficulty to use social media in the same way as Trump or others did in the past.
Yeah. What do you think about that? I mean, Silicon Valley sort of censoring politicians that they don't like. It seems like they're doing so, and it seems like the excuses they make for doing that are sort of this edge thing where, you know, it's all based on interpretation. Well, he's spreading lies. Well, is it a lie? For example, the hydroxychloroquine. Is that a lie? But they're going to edit it and they're going to put these little things, and then they kick them off Twitter. I mean, so it's very strange time we live in, I think.
The interesting thing is that the political steering of social media is quite similar, despite the differences in political leanings between the CEOs.
Could you elaborate?
So basically, I don't presume to truly know what Mark Zuckerberg thinks, but from my perspective, he is probably a slightly conservative centrist with liberal to libertarian perspectives, based on the adjacency that he has to the people that he has dinner with, and which is not necessarily always a good predictor. But I suspect that he is more of, or that he's less left-leaning than, say, for instance, Jack Dorsey, who leads Twitter, who I think is mostly progressive. He's not on the far left, I think, but he is probably left of center and so on. And with Google, it's more mixed. And they all basically come down to the same policies. And I suspect this happens to a large degree due to outside pressure, because the large social media companies in the US have semi-monopolies for the space that they are working in. And there is pressure by politics using anti-monopolistic measures against them if they don't comply. And so the issue is more that people are in power that are not in agreement with the social messaging that is possible on social media or was part of it, and that would like to have more control over it. A slightly more general perspective would be to say that if you have a free and open internet or a free and open system of broadcasting, then this will enable the spread of arbitrary ideas. And some of these ideas will be instrumental to forming cults and closed organizations. So just because it's possible by an open society, political cults will form.
Except didn't we have this already? You come from my era, so we had BBSs, right? So but no cults really formed that sort of rip the fabric of society. So where's the evidence? This is just imagination that we're using now, right? This is sort of fear the open internet, because this might happen. Yeah.
The mainstream didn't take place in the BBSs. I think that back then, when we had Usenet as the main internet, most of the people that participated in it were computer nerds. And they were not a typical sample of society. They were mostly autistic kids sitting in the basement. We were called freaks. I remember this, computer freaks. And it was something that we possibly identified with, but being a freak was not meant as a term of endearment by the people that called us like this, right? We were these kids sitting in the basement, not interacting with other kids, not playing soccer. We were playing with these unhealthy things, with bytes and bits. And then we discovered that they were more like us, so we had not to be lonely, but we could spend our time together. And then this became more and more popular, and more students, especially computer science students, entered this field in the early 90s and started playing in this community. And then we had this phenomenon of every September, a new group of people would flood our forums and not behave well because they didn't know the rules by which to which you had agreed. That, for instance, what rules do you need to have free and open rational debate? So the civility that you have, we call this netiquette, right? So how do you discuss with each other so you don't disrupt the conversation, that you don't impose a style of interaction that is detrimental to the free exchange of ideas. And this socialization took place over a few months after every September. And then AOL came along and opened up the internet to the general public. And this phenomenon is often called the eternal September, because this time the September didn't end, right? And so the internet was built by a very small avant-garde that had its own rules and its own subculture. And then the mainstream moved into the buildings of the avant-garde. And whenever that happens, the mainstream is not adopting the rules of the avant-garde. It's just adopting their buildings and their infrastructure, and then behaves as the mainstream always does.
Yeah. So you're saying that there were Jack Dorseys back then. They were just much smaller scale, enforcing the rules.
And I don't think that Jack Dorsey believes very much in enforcing certain rules. I think that he is, by and large, a liberal and would have preferred if people can talk any way they want to. But what happens if there is a group which is currently in power and says, you know, you have this these bad ideas on that are obviously bad ideas. You can point at them, right? And it doesn't really matter that most of the outgroups that we have in the US, all these really evil groups of MRAs and Nazis and so on, they're typically between a few 10,000 and maybe 1 million people, right? Less than 1% of the population. They're typically between 0.01% and 1%.
I see.
Right, and that's also the reason why these outgroups disappear into nowhere once the dominant group is no longer focused on them. Right, so when the most dominant political group was feminist in the US, the enemies were Gamergate and the MRAs, the men's rights activists, and for some reasons they have disappeared. Right, it's not that these people have gone; they're still existing, but they're no longer.
What was Gamergate again? Gamergate was the girl that slept with someone for review or something. Was that Gamergate?
the Gamergate was the gamers that were exposed by this guy who was talking about his evil girlfriend, and that were obviously showing the alliance to evil patriarchal computer nerds who don't have girlfriends because they are evil and despicable, and they are in political opposition to everything that's good and right. Right?
Okay.
It was this strong opposition between gaming journalists on blogs and gamers. And the question was,
okay,
were there ever actual groups that were homogeneous in a way, or was this a fabricated disagreement, right, between a group of kids that were into which it was projected that they were in favor of the patriarchy and anti-feminist and reactionary and evil and misogynist, and a group of well-meaning feminists that tried to get to a cultural revolution in gaming in which there would be free and open participation by women and girls and everybody else in gaming. And the thing is that for every narrative that every group in this political controversy had, there were extremely good examples, right? Because the world is large. There are tens of thousands of people involved and wrote posts of them, and many of them were completely stupid and ill-advised and whatever. And so you could construct arbitrary narratives, and everybody who chose to pick a side would find ample evidence for their own narrative in that whole thing, right? So all these stories in a way were true, but the overarching narrative was a poor model of reality, because the groups involved were just a few thousand people on each side, right? So they create a lot of content that is dominating a discourse for everybody who wants to read that discourse. But eventually it is a very minor thing compared to what actually happens in society. And that's the reason why these groups tend to disappear once you have a different power struggle. Every group that is in power is going to find an enemy, and that enemy is going to be the dominant thing that we all have to be worried and scared about.
I'm looking for meaning in the examples you're giving. Are you saying that sort of the top-down Jack Dorsey censoring, this has been happening all the time, and this is nothing new? Is that what you're saying? That
of course
we
it's
survived
nothing new.
Gamergate, we survived Gamergate, and nothing big happened. Society didn't collapse, so we shouldn't make a big deal of it? Or did I miss?
No, it's slightly different. The point is that every time a new type of media emerges, society gets into disarray. That happened when the printing press was invented, and it happened when the radio was invented, and when the TV was invented, right? So the modernist societies, something like fascism and communism, probably would not have emerged in the same way without broadcasting. Right? The broadcasting of opinions was completely crucial to synchronize the ideas of people. Before that, you only had the church. And now suddenly you could transplant ideas into the minds of people not just once a week, but every day, multiple times a day. And it was only a matter of time until broadcasting of ideas, of printed and of electromagnetically broadcasted news was controlled. And eventually media was controlled by relatively few voices, by large groups of owners of media conglomerates that made sure that a certain range of opinions was permissible, and things outside of this range of opinion was downvoted, suppressed, filtered, and did not reach the majority of people. And when social media came up, this was disrupted. And Trump exploited the fact that he could bypass media, right? Even when the majority of media was strongly opposed to Trump and was not going to give him a fair hearing during the interviews, but would use the interviews only to deconstruct him or primarily to undermine him, he would just ignore them and use social media to interact with his audience directly. And this is a temporary phenomenon, because whatever institution is in power is not interested in such a situation. Right? So the free and open internet, if it is actually free and open, is going to have side effects in society that lead to the groups in power clamping down on social media. And there is only so much that social media can do to resist.
And this happens with every evolution.
Yes, I think it happens in every step, that there needs to be a new balance in this free and open expression. And I don't think that social media will make all open discussion impossible. But what it makes impossible is to broadcast every kind of discussion. Right? So when Trump loses his Twitter account, the point is not so much to disallow Trump to speak what he wants. He can still say what he wants. It's about disallowing people to listen what he has to say. Right? This is not about making sure that a single person cannot express their opinion. It's about making sure that millions of people cannot listen to these opinions, that want to, that were subscribing to Trump explicitly.
And this is natural, you're saying? This is natural.
It's in the interest of any group that is in power to make sure that ideas that compete with them are not
if we scale it down to the BBS example. So when we were on BBSs, I mean, if you had 100 people, that was a lot of people, at least on the BBS that I was on. And so you're saying if a person like that came on, he would have been censored too?
No, I think that we were irrelevant. The people that were organized on the Usenet were a very small subculture of society, and because they were not critical mass, nobody cared very much about what they were saying. I remember that we were super paranoid. We were pretty sure that in every large group that was discussing things on the internet, there would be government agents listening to us. And the secret services were subverting our communications. There were a lot of tinfoil hattery going on.
That's why you're also
a few government.
You're in Eastern Germany. Okay.
Mostly for us, this happened after the wall came down because
okay.
Before the wall came down, we're not really allowed to participate in the internet. It was very hard to go online and exchange emails, and a few people did, but it was very difficult because our phone lines in Eastern Germany were really monitored all the time.
Yeah.
So that was very hard. And
did you watch the movie War Games with Matthew Broderick?
Yes, of course.
Okay, when you were that age.
Yeah. But I got my Commodore 64 in 1983, so relatively early.
Me too.
And the wall came down in 1989. And the internet mostly took off after that. And the World Wide Web really took off in the early 90s. So around, I think, 1992 was when our university built its first web server. And it was one of the first universities in Germany to do so.
Yeah. But I'm talking about modems and dial-up. And
yes, but modems and dial-up, I think that really took off in the late 80s.
Yeah. But like I said, at the time when that movie came out, the War Games, we all tried it, the fracking.
Yeah.
Sort of. Yeah.
And US was early.
Creating programs that just dialed numbers, trying to get a signal, and once you did, and then trying to crack the password. And
also a lot
that was much earlier than 89. That was
true.
Yeah, about 84, 85. Yeah.
And the organized computing scene emerged over the hacking scene, right? And the hacking scene in US, for instance, had the phreaking, the technology that was developed to hack the phone system by making sounds on the phone lines that would allow you to make free calls, right?
And all you had to do was just make the same tone. So you had to.
Yes. And I think it largely worked because the phone companies were not defending against the petty crimes of kids.
Yeah.
And our generation, we were largely those kids, right? That thought we are changing society, and we had this amazing future of free communication between everyone. And this would create a global village where everybody would come down on the same level and understand each other, and we will build a much better and freer and more well-coordinated society with each other. And this idea, in some sense, has never died, even though the internet has changed. The subculture still exists.
So I saw a lecture that you gave where you think the universe is an automaton, and you use the Commodore 64 as an example of a computer that's capable of running this automaton. And I find that just, how is that even possible? Something so weak as a Commodore 64 being able to scale up to.
Well, it would require you to have infinite memory on the Commodore 64. Maybe not infinite, but very, very large memory. And
okay, so the message you're saying is that everything you need at a basic level is there. You just scale it up.
Yes. So, and what you need to scale up, of course, if you live inside of the Commodore 64, is not necessarily the speed, because if the Commodore 64 runs slower and the entire universe that you are in runs slower, it runs slower only with respect to the parent universe, not with respect to your own. Right. So for you inside, it doesn't matter how fast your computer is, but in order to store enough state, you need to have enough memory.
Okay, so processor speed is irrelevant in storage.
Yes. And the idea of a Turing machine is basically if you give a system no limit in the storage, then all systems that are able to perform changes in state based on rules deterministically have the same power. And this is the Church Turing
including
thesis.
the original Turing machine? Wasn't the original Turing machine punch cards?
No, the original Turing machine is a hypothetical mathematical machine that was invented by Alan Turing to make a mathematical proof about decidability of mathematical theorems, and eventually.
So this is the Hilbert.
That's a part of the Hilbert
mathematical
program.
conjecture where you try to make mathematics complete, consistent,
yes.
and decidable.
Yes,
and
it's
then
basically a
Turing
different
proved
version of the Gödel proof that Gödel did two major proofs, and Gödel proof works by self-reference, and the Turing proof works via the halting problem, by the question whether an algorithm that is being executed on a machine ends with a certain result. And what he could show is that you cannot make the proof in the general case that whether a program halts or not. So you cannot write a program that for an arbitrary program decides whether that program is going to halt with a certain result.
Okay. So what does that mean for mathematics? You said something, the mathematics is the domain of all languages. Mm-hmm. And just from a layman, just from a layman, I mean, how does mathematics describe things like emotions? I mean, you say it's the domain of all languages. Well, you know, in language, we can describe what love is. We can describe it. How could mathematics describe those things? Are you saying that we just don't understand emotions right now, or something abstract, like abstract concepts like that, is mathematics capable of describing?
So if mathematicians would want to describe emotion, they would have to build up from very small elements, from axioms and rules, to get to a specification of what emotion is. And there are attempts to do this, and they exist in computer science, where we try to make models of emotion and motivation that we specify as code, as computer programs, right? These are mathematical languages, and we use formal specification languages, where we describe the parameters of a space of behaviors, and then we would say that there are certain configurations of that space that we would call emotions. For instance, there are several schools of formalizing emotions in this way within cognitive science, and the boundary between cognitive science and psychology. And in some sense, that would be a mathematization of emotion. It's not necessarily in the core of mathematics, because mathematicians study the structure and properties of these languages. Right? So they look at the deeper level of the code. They look at the nature of the algorithms that underlie the generation of things. And traditionally, mathematics does not look at mathematics as a collection of algorithms, because mathematics is often defined in a state-free fashion. You don't write how the mathematician goes from one state of a system that performs computations to the next, but you write it down in such a way that the computation is implicit, for instance, via an index that tells you how a system would progress through states. But this timeless way in which the mathematical functions are noted down allows you to have functions that take in infinitely many arguments or output infinitely many digits. Right?
But so it'll never remember the previous.
It doesn't need to. You just specify that the entire set of states. Right? Mathematicians are often fine with specifying it, and if it's specified in a definite way, then the computation can be left as an exercise to the reader or God. And the difference between this way of doing mathematics and computation is that sometimes in the computational world, there is a difference between the specification and the implementation. And what Gödel and Turing focused on was the fact that you get at some point to definitions in mathematics that you cannot implement in any kind of mathematical universe. So the mathematical machine that tries to follow the semantics of infinity might crash. And if your semantic crashes, it doesn't work, right? So you need to have a different semantics. And this came as a big shock to Gödel, because he truly believed in the way that mathematicians did mathematics. And the alternative to that is constructive mathematics, that is computation. This means that you define systems that get to their results step by step, and you cannot make a claim that you got to a certain result, or the certain thing has a certain particular kind of value without showing that result. So from this perspective, for instance, pi is not a value because you don't know the last digit of pi. Instead, pi becomes a function. And in classical mathematics, a value and a function are equivalent if you can give a procedure to compute that function, right? If you have some kind of method,
so
and you have a method to compute.
You would pass in how many decimal places you want in the function and just get that back instead of it just running forever.
Yeah, or you could, for instance, have an algorithm that continuously spits out new digits of pi, right? And that would be a function that computes pi. And there's a set of such functions. It's a relatively large set, right? If you allow infinities, it's even an infinitely large set of functions. But practically, you can only enumerate a finite set of functions that will, or a bounded set of functions that bounded by the time that you have.
I see.
To generate these algorithms, right? So eventually your mathematics comes to the things that can be implemented in the universe that you are in. And the important result that Turing had is if you remove memory constraints, then there is always a mapping between the different machines, right? So any kind of machine that can execute programs is going to have the same power as all the other machines that can execute programs because you can always give such a mapping. And the mathematical proof runs by taking any of these systems that define such machines, for instance, the lambda calculus that you can expand into the programming language Lisp, and the Turing machine, which is a hypothetical machine with an infinite tape on which you write characters from a finite alphabet. And you have a table that decides for each of the characters that you read, whether to move your tape to the left or to the right, and whether to eradicate the current symbol and replace it by a different one. And this is all there is to the Turing machine. And it can be shown that you can calculate the lambda calculus on the Turing machine, and that you can calculate the Turing machine in the lambda calculus. And you can do this for all the programming languages.
So is the lambda calculus a Turing machine?
Yes, they are the same. They're just different ways of notating it, of writing it down.
Okay.
And the proof is very similar to showing that Python and Java are equivalent, because you can write a Java interpreter or compiler in Python and vice versa, right? So they have the same power. There is a constant time that you would need for the translation. And so it's basically Java is the same thing as Python plus a constant time for the compilation from one language into the other.
I saw you were on a panel. I'm sorry to interrupt you. But it's interesting. It was the whole theme of the panel was what is life? Mm-hmm. But I really liked your answer. Your answer was just life is the cell. Mm-hmm. It was very simple. Yeah, and you call the cell a Turing machine.
The cell contains a Turing machine, right? The cell is in some sense a supermolecule. And normal molecules are stable because they have dynamics that resist most of the disturbances by the universe. That's why molecules stay around. Things that resist the disturbances of the universe only a short time are so unstable that we don't get to observe them for very long. And molecules are so apparent to us as building blocks because they are so stable. It's possible to break them up. They are harder to break up than cells, for instance, or rocks. Right, so they are more atomic building blocks, but they're easier to break up than atoms, and definitely easier to break up than elementary particles. Right, so they have regulation dynamics that keep them stable even if you push them. And a cell is much larger and more complicated, and therefore more brittle. So if you push the cell, it would fall apart a lot of the times. And why is it possible for the cell to exist regardless? That's because the cell is able to prepare for many of the disturbances that can happen to it. It's able to predict the state of the universe around it to some degree, and then mount defenses to they're very specific. It executes programs that are encoded in its DNA to deal with many of the sorts of disturbances that the universe throws at the cell. So in many cases, the cell is going to survive and remain stable even if you change its environment.
So what are the attributes of a Turing machine that the cell... So the attributes of a Turing machine, one Turing machine can copy the expected behavior of any other Turing machine.
Yes, but the self-replication is necessary for the cell to be implemented in the way that it is, right? So the cell is not able to deal with every kind of disturbance, but it doesn't matter, because if it fails, then there will still be other cells. And many of these cells will be able eventually to adapt by having small changes in random changes due to evolution in their DNA that will lead to different responses to the same disturbances in the environment. So some of the cells, if there are enough, will survive. And just by the sheer numbers, if the cell is going to try many different solutions to the problems that the universe poses for them at once in parallel, and some of them are going to work better, and this leads to the replication of these new solutions. And this is how the cell is able to program itself. So it's a search algorithm that works based on the differential success of the different instances of the program that runs on the cell. What you need to have in order to implement a computer, a Turing machine is just a word for computer, is you need to have a way to store state and a way to execute rules that change the state in a deterministic fashion. And you can deal with a degree of indeterminism, but what you need is enough determinism to make it happen. Because indeterminism is just deleting some of the bits that you compute. It doesn't help. Sometimes you need
indeterminism or determinism.
Indeterminism is deleting bits, right? Some of the things that you computed are randomly changed. That is what indeterminism means for a control system. And for a control system, the important thing is the part that it can control. And to control, it needs to do things in a particular way every time in response. And if a function works the same every time in response to a certain input, then it's deterministic. If it works differently in different times, then it's indeterministic. And differently in different times doesn't mean that if you add two different numbers, you get different results. But if you add the same numbers, you get the same result, right? Every time you add the same two numbers, you want to have the same output. Every time the cell encounters the same circumstances and environment, and there's a particular correct solution to escape these circumstances or to deal with them, the cell should show exactly that kind of behavior, right? So this is what matters in this control structure. And so a Turing machine is, in some sense, a state machine that is able to revisit earlier states and to explore a state space in a deterministic fashion.
Okay, so it's got memory, so it can revisit previous states. Okay, but you're not saying a cell is a Turing machine. You're saying it just implements that interface, right? So
it also has it also has a Turing machine inside of it, among other things, right? It also has a self-replicator and mechanism to extract like entropy from the environment. It's just not just a Turing machine. The cell is the smallest system I'm aware of that implements a Turing machine in nature.
That's also your answer to the meaning of life, I think, of one of your. It was maybe it was a panel or something, but somebody asked you what the meaning of life was, and you started off with, well, life is the cell, and then you started there, and then you built up to it. Yeah.
Let's see who said this.
Yeah, I'm fairly certain. I wish I had the reference or the video where you said it. But
yes, so Michael Russell, an astrobiologist, once said that the meaning of life is the hydrogenation of carbon dioxide.
That's the meaning of life that we should all.
No, not we, but because we are not all of life, right? We are just a very small part of that whole project. And he bases this on the observation that most of life on Earth is driven by taking carbon dioxide and adding hydrogen to it. So you get organic chemistry and build structure out of organic chemistry, right? This is what plants are doing. They take the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and use solar energy to bind this into solid structure, right? And then at some point, some kind of singularity happened because some cells discovered that they can harvest more energy, not from solar energy, but by eating other cells, right? And then burning them again and releasing the carbon dioxide, which is what animals are doing, right? So it's not necessarily, no, it's not the same thing. Like entropy is basically the opposite of entropy. It's order. It's what's being consumed by a system that lives in an entropic universe and tries to build and stabilize its own structure. It relies on neg entropy or syntropy, the opposite of entropy.
Eating is not an example of harvesting neg entropy.
It is. It is
creating
an example
order
of,
out of
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But isn't that what you said the cells are doing?
That's what cells are doing. So plants are mostly using solar energy to bind carbon dioxide, and animals are eating plants for the most part to release carbon dioxide again. And as a result, you now close a cycle. And this cycle relies, for the most part, on solar energy. There's also some life going on around deep sea vents. So the story of the hybridization of carbon dioxide is at best incomplete, right? But it's a nice metaphor. So, but this the dominant chemical reaction is taking in sunlight to bind carbon dioxide and then release the carbon dioxide again by eating the plants and burning them in the process.
Yeah.
And then
so you avoided the question basically when you were on the panel and you said that, because I think what they're trying to say is the meaning of life insofar as this dream that we're in, right? So that you describe it as the mind.
I'm not avoiding the question at all, I think. If we take a step back, what happens with life on Earth is that cells are chemical reactors that are able to outcompete dumb chemical reactions via control, right? Some kind of intelligence that is implemented in the cell, in its DNA, in its repository of programs that help us to deal with complicated circumstances around it. So what cells are doing, they add a little bit of energy to a reaction that otherwise would not be possible. And then as a result, they can harvest more energy. This ability to build controlled reactors, that's the market opportunity for cells, right? And this creates more and more complexity, right? The addition of animal life to plant life closes a loop that allows life to harvest even more neg entropy, more structure from sunlight, and build more complexity. And so what life is doing, it builds bridges from the ordered world into the domain of chaos. And this bridgehead from order into chaos is what we call complexity. Right? So what life is doing, it creates complexity in chemical reactions. Because it can. It is an opportunity that it has in a universe where other things are dumber than life. And more complicated, more intelligent life is able to erect more complicated surfaces. So once I said that everything that humanity is doing is, well, we are basically a kind of yeast. And we erect surfaces that allow us to outcompete other types of yeast. And this is what our civilization is about. Right? We try to
but again, the fact that we're laughing is reinforcement to the fact that, of course, what you're saying is correct. It's 100% correct. Literally, it's 100%. But I meant, and I think the way it was asked you was like, hey, was it Lex Friedman? It was like, what is the meaning of life? Like he said it in a way where it's like, hey, man, tell me what the point of our existence should be. Maybe the survival of the human species. It's
how far do you zoom out? What is the meaning of your own life, right? It could be to get to the next hour.
It's a creation of your mind.
To get your descendants on the path to success. It could be to support the sustainability of the societies that your descendants and the descendants of your friends and everybody else is going to live in. It could also be life on Earth. And eventually there is going to be a divergence in the aesthetics. One is either it's about humans, and life on Earth is just the starting point for humans in the universe, right? This is the transhumanist perspective. So we turn, after we manage to subdue and govern the entirety of life on Earth to such a point that it becomes a big farm and factory for our food. And we maximize the number of healthy human beings that we can then send out in space. Of course, we will need to change them so they can survive in space, because the human body is not optimal, right? You want to create something that is able to survive on Mars, right? That means it should be able to survive maybe without atmosphere, at least intermittently. It should be able to use all kinds of food sources that are on Mars, which for the most parts will probably be human beings. So our children maybe should look like the alien in the Giga movie, right?
That's interesting. Yeah, because there's a show called The Expanse where they didn't make these modifications, I think. And the humans that would go back to Earth actually had a hugely hard time to negotiate just walking around and things like that. But what you're saying is through maybe genetic manipulation, we can craft humans to ideally live in these different environments.
Right. If you think this to the end, right, it's this transhumanist perspective is very radical, because eventually you have to give up human aesthetics. And the alternative is to say that the point is to preserve life on Earth in in relatively the way it is, which means it's still going to be dynamic. There's still going to be changes in the environment, in the ecosystems, and so on. But humanity is a small part of that. Humanity is not meant to be at the top and turn everything into a factory farm that stably serves the need of humanity, regardless of what happens in the universe around it, right? The question is, if you have an intelligent ape, what is the best role that this intelligent ape can have in the ecosystems at large? And that would probably be to support Gaia, basically a sentient ecological agent that in which we play a very small role. There's going to be an optimal number of human beings that probably tops out at a few 100 million beings. And they should live in such a way that they don't impact the ecology of the planet too much, at least not more than they benefited at the same time. And in this way, humanity would serve biological life best. And so somebody said that there are only two ways to think about the future of humanity, and this is transhumanism or Ted Kaczynski. There's nothing in between. That is a very radical perspective, admittedly, right? And
yeah, he left that.
Dark.
It was longer than a pamphlet, but what he thought about technology and its impact on the human species. But I do have a quote from you I'd just like to say. You say, we as a species act like we are parasites on this planet, like lice on the fur of Gaia. We cannot do this anymore. We have subdued this planet and can no longer afford to act like parasites. We have to instead become the nervous system of this planet. And no organism can afford to have a nervous system that lies to itself. I think that's such a great thing. I think you ended that with saying how general artificial intelligence could help us with this.
Yeah, that is about as optimistic as I can get.
I think it's beautifully said. And there was a podcast you were on, and you were talking about how Buddhism is an idealist philosophy that makes the dream primary, I think you said. And you said that Buddhists solve the id problem, id being that reptilian part of our brain, by having to create an identity between where you are and where you should be. You get there and you're done. And I paraphrase you probably, but the visualization I have in my head is this Asian monk sitting there, attaining peace and not participating in society and just slowly disintegrating. And then you say, well, Christianity says the bad news is because you had an extramarital sex, you're going to hell. Good news is I sacrificed my only son for you. So if you work hard, you can go to heaven with him. This leads to a lot of suffering, but it also leads to roads and hospitals. So just to push back a little, number one, that's to say that the Eastern religions are the reasons why they don't have roads and hospitals. I think it's a little stretch, but I think there is some logic in what you're saying, that although Christianity is slightly bent in the amount of suffering that it causes the population, they did eventually lead to hospitals.
There is, I think, a difference that the Eastern religions often are about liberating the individual in the here and now, by telling them how to deal with their discrepancy in their self-image and their motivation and the guilt that they experience and the suffering that they experience. And by mitigating the suffering, we achieve an adaptation of the individual to its existing environmental conditions, which is in some sense similar to stoicism. It means that you are focusing on those things that you can regulate and that you accept the things that you cannot change. And this, by becoming one with the situation that you're in and with the regulation that is required by this present situation, the individual is able to focus on its existence instead of existence in a potentially better universe, right? You give up this notion of how the universe should be, and rather you observe how the universe is and what can be done under the circumstances. And that's very different from the Christian perspective, which liberates the individual in the afterlife. And in this life, you have to deal with the hardship and you have to accept your guilt and use this guilt as a motivation to work harder. And the fact that you're not okay with the way with which you are because you are a sinner, you're not doing everything that God demands of you because you are imperfect. That is a reason for you to work harder, to produce more, to give more to society than you consume.
But there is some irony in that, though. So you're saying the Buddhists fixed something. They fixed something, and that could be mental suffering, right? So that's sort of could be considered a very detrimental thing for a human being. And they inserted a medicine which fixed that. But by fixing that, you're equating that to no hospitals and no roads. So, and again, the image is this monk that's like, okay, I'm done, right? He's not going out trying to compete with society or trying to have sex and have kids or not trying to do these things. Instead, he's sitting there in that position, just concentrating, in my mind anyways. And it sounds
so I didn't mean to imply that that's also not what I said, that Buddhism means that you have no roads and hospitals. No, what I said was slightly different. Basically, you have the Christian missionaries coming into cultures that are basically fine with their relationship to the world and their own sexuality. And they mess up the relationship that the individual has to the world and to their own sexuality and so on, by imposing a notion of guilt in the face of God onto them. And this guilt is necessary and is an important tool in motivating people to produce more output than consumption. And this allows you to impose an administration on society that uses this additional output to create infrastructure. And arguably, this has not always worked very well, where the missionaries tried to impose this in the Third World, but it worked relatively well in Europe. So the societies that we had built in Europe were built with these Christian values, with this notion of sin and guilt and the need to collaborate in the here and now, also under conditions that you might find unjust, because your king has a better life than you have and so on, because you get paid back in the afterlife and because God demands it. But it's a very simplistic interpretation of what happened, but I think there is some truth to it. And I don't think that this philosophy of having to suffer in the here and now, because it's justified by the greater whole, is the same as the philosophy that you have in Buddhism.
Wow. So you mentioned Stoicism, and it's the parallels to that in Buddhism. You said something in one of your interviews, how Stoicism might not be conducive, or it might reduce the evolutionary fitness of an individual.
And of the group. So I think that it's good for the individual to have a better life, right? If you are a Stoic, you are better adapted to the circumstances that you find yourself to be in, because you make it the direction of your life to worry about the things that you can change, but not have emotions about the things that you cannot change. And in this way, most cats, for instance, are Stoics. But also most cats are not very active, right? They're fine lying around 10 to 16 hours a day and not do anything. And the human being is the animal that is discontent. We're always meddling, we're always getting up and doing things. And that's because we are largely not Stoics. And I suspect that societies of Stoics might be happier societies, but of course less productive societies, because there is less reason to meddle and do things.
Okay, so you're saying that Stoics don't wake up in the morning and be satisfied with their surroundings, because subjectively I agree with you, but you're saying in a group situation, Stoics don't get up and are unsatisfied.
I suspect that a lot of our productivity is not unleashed just by the need to feed our kids, but also by the need to escape suffering.
Okay.
So by imposing suffering, you can often make people more productive.
Okay, so it's a way of thinking. So yeah,
it's a way to organize society.
If you're a Stoic, you're not suffering from another ideology like Christianity.
Yes, so Christianity, in some sense, imposes suffering on individuals. But the suffering from the perspective of Christianity is justified, because the suffering is an expression of your acknowledgement of your own sins. And your sin is the deviation from between what you do and what you should be doing, based on what you can recognize you should be doing, because God demands it. And God is your best understanding of what the next level agent demands of you.
I think the reason I missed your point there was because I thought the suffering that human beings faced was sort of something that was in us. It wasn't taught to us, it was in us. But you're saying that this is an ideology that we all bought into. The suffering is self-made. And if we just believe something else, then the suffering goes away. So if we go,
it's very hard to escape the programming, right? It seems to be that people have are born with differences in how much they suffer. and how likely they are to adopt certain ideas on how they should live and how they should interact with each other. So I suspect that in the same way as we have behavioral differences in animals, right? If you try to take in a cat, and the cat is much closer to the feral archetype of the cat, to a wild cat, and it's going to be harder to socialize it, right? And there are other cats which are extremely docile, and so I suspect that these social differences that you have in animals, and they're not all learned, and but of course you can override them. You can often train them, and in the same way, people train themselves and choose to be trained by others. I think the decision to submit to somebody else is often a decision that the mind has to make autonomously, right? Whether you take in ideas from others, whether you're influenced by others, depends on how you are set up to begin with. And I suspect that we are largely a domesticated species. So we are not, very few of us are feral, very few of us are sovereigns. We are a programmable species. And we have basically bred ourselves for being programmable over thousands of years. And this has made us so successful because we were able to impose social software on each other that allows us to act in a synchronized fashion.
Amazing. Okay, last thing. Lebowski, I promise this is the last thing. With 3 minutes. Lebowski theory. You've got this idea that a super intelligent being will do no more than hack its own reward function. Okay, that's your theory, that you came up with that. But my slight pushback intelligent beings, and don't we occasionally hack our reward function, and yet we don't stop there. So we go through the crisis of meaning, and then we make decisions, and sometimes we recover from that crisis of meaning and go and build a well in Africa. You know, we find new meaning. So how could the Lebowski theory be true if there are exceptions like that?
I think that humans are
You're
not super intelligent. We are limited in the space of behaviors that we can explore because our life is relatively short. And this also protects us in a way, right? We have exceptional individuals that are like viruses, people like Genghis Khan and Stalin and Hitler and Napoleon. And then they die. And then the movement stops that they managed to impose on society at large. Right? So from time to time, you get viral individuals that you cannot really contain. And this other thing, the individuals which have too much agency in some sense are a problem. I suspect that Jeff Bezos is also in this category. His goal is to turn the entire universe into Amazonium.
Yeah.
And right, he's not as violent as Napoleon in the ways that he is transfiguring the universe, but there is a transfiguration going on there. And the opposite is a lack of agency, or a digestion of your own agency, and of the people that digest their own agency, that decide to fix their own motivational system, are not that apparent in the world at large. They remove themselves from the modes of interaction with others.
Okay.
So you find these people in monasteries that basically they will sit down in groups and meditate until they are freed from the need to play any kind of game in the world. And when that happens, they no longer have an effect on the world as a result, right? They disappear. And what would happen if we all could live forever and if we had unlimited resources? Would we be willing to submit to anything if we can create everything that we could possibly achieve in much more pure form as a mental representation? Right? Why work if you realize that everything that you experience is the result of a dream that your own brain is generating for you, and you get agency of what the dream looks like? And you realize that there is just nothing in the existence of the physical universe that would be worth to go into any trouble, right? Then the organism would lose any hold on you. The organism could no longer enslave you to serve its needs. And because you have realized you are not that organism, you are a side effect of its regulation needs, and what you serve is entirely your own choice. So when you can edit your own source code to remove all suffering, to remove all discrepancy between what is and what should be, you stop doing things. And you solved all your problems.
You've changed after, it's like a mind, after I heard you say that, I heard you say that in a previous interview that you had. Now, when I watch things like Westworld or I watch shows like Ex Machina, I don't see robots. I don't see robots achieving consciousness anymore. I see the metaphor or the analogy of human beings. So when I see those shows, we're supposed to all sit there on our couch and believe that these robots are to achieve consciousness and they're like waking up. And then when I see that now, I'm like, no, that's not the robot. This is this is art. This is them trying to get me to understand that this could be human beings realizing suddenly when they look in the mirror in the morning, I'm in the body of a monkey, and you could see the cells having little meetings saying, holy shit, he just woke up. What are we going to
Exactly.
do? And then you're just basically sitting there. It's like, I'm a mind. I'm not this body, but we tend to think that because there's this one-to-one tether, right?
Yeah.
So until we can upload whatever that thing is, there's this one-to-one tether, our body dies, then the software dies, But yeah, you did that after I heard that. Now when I see these movies like Westworld, I don't see robots getting consciousness. I see sort of the metaphor of human beings waking up and saying, holy cow, I'm this, intelligent being. So that's amazing. But Joscha, that amazing conversation. I just can't describe how much I've learned tonight.
It was a very pleasant conversation, Aaron. Thank you.